Microsoft decides which options appear when you right-click a file and which ones get buried 3 layers deep because the design team somewhere decided simplicity mattered more than your actual workflow. Most people accept this because they assume the only realistic alternatives are switching operating systems entirely, or spending hours wrestling with registry editors and system files that could break their install with one wrong keystroke. That assumption has been wrong for a while now, and this video is going to walk through exactly why, using a tool that's already quietly become one of the most widely installed Windows customization projects of the past several years. I want to be upfront about what changed my thinking here, because it matters for understanding why this particular tool is different from nearly everything else in this space. I'd gone through the full ritual of manual registry edits, pulled from guides on Reddit and 11 forum, applied them, watched them quietly break after the next Windows update, then repeated the whole process again a few weeks later. It was functional but fragile, the kind of setup that demands maintenance on a schedule and still leaves real gaps between what you actually want Windows to do and what it's currently doing. It surfaced through research into Windows 11's 24H2 update behavior, mentioned repeatedly across threads on Windows Forum and the r/Windows 11 subreddit. And once I looked at the installation count sitting on some of its top mods, it became clear that hundreds of thousands of people were already quietly running something that had barely registered on my radar. It's worth understanding the broader landscape this tool sits inside, because Windhawk didn't emerge in a vacuum. StartAllBack and OpenShell approached the same underlying frustration by replacing entire shell components wholesale, which tends to be effective but also fragile in exactly the way registry hacks are fragile, since replacing a core Windows component means every future Windows update carries a real chance of breaking that replacement outright. Explorer Patcher takes a more surgical approach closer to Windhawk's own philosophy, but its development has been considerably less consistent, with periods where compatibility with new Windows builds lagged noticeably behind. Windhawk's distinguishing characteristic isn't that it invented the idea of runtime modification. It's that it turned runtime modification into a genuine platform with a marketplace structure, a consistent update cadence, and a modular system where each individual mod can be toggled independently rather than forcing you to accept or reject one giant bundled patch. That structural difference is what makes it realistic to run a dozen or more mods simultaneously without the whole setup becoming an unmanageable all-or-nothing gamble every time Microsoft ships a new build. The project comes from Michael Maltsev, the same developer behind 7+ Taskbar Tweaker, a tool a significant portion of Windows Power users ran for years across Windows 7 and Windows 10. If you remember what that tool meant for daily usability back then, you already have the closest available reference point for what Windhawk represents on Windows 11. The development philosophy is the same, the code quality bar is the same, and the result is a tool that modifies genuine system behavior rather than painting cosmetic changes over an otherwise untouched shell. Windhawk was first announced back in March of 2022, and it's been under continuous active development since, which matters, because in December 2025 it shipped version 1.7, a genuinely substantial update. Mod installation became dramatically faster because the platform switched to downloading pre-compiled mods hosted on GitHub by default, instead of compiling them locally on your own machine, which eliminated a real pain point that users on lower-end hardware had been reporting for a while. Version 1.7 also added the ability to install previous versions of any individual mod, giving you a genuine rollback path if a newly updated mod introduces behavior you don't want. You can now search and filter your installed mods directly. Updating the application itself became a single click from the About tab, and the settings interface picked up a YAML text mode that makes managing mods, with a lot of configuration options, considerably easier to work with. The same release also quietly fixed compatibility issues with several professional creative applications, including SideFX Houdini and Autodesk Motion Builder that had previously failed to launch correctly while Windhawk was running, the kind of unglamorous bug fix that tells you a project is being maintained seriously rather than left to drift. What this means practically is that you're not installing some static tool frozen at a fixed capability level from years ago. You're installing a platform that's been actively developed for years, gained real momentum as Windows 11's accumulated frustrations built up across the user base, and now sits at a point where its mod catalog covers nearly every meaningful category of interface friction users have complained about since 2021. The Windows 11 Taskbar styler mod alone has been installed by hundreds of thousands of users. The Start menu styler consistently ranks among the top 2 or 3 mods in the entire catalog by install volume. These aren't experimental tweaks with a few hundred downloads and an uncertain future. They're battle-tested modifications that have run across an enormous range of hardware configurations and Windows build versions without producing the kind of systemic instability that critics of deep customization tools routinely warn about. I'm not claiming there's zero risk here. Any tool operating at this level deserves an honest assessment, and I'll address the stability question directly later in this video. What I am saying is that Windhawk's risk profile, given its fully open source nature, its modular architecture, and the sheer scale of community testing behind its most popular mods, is genuinely different from what the phrase system modification tool usually implies. Installing it changed how I use Windows every single day. That's not a phrase I'm using casually, and by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why. Let's start with the taskbar, because that's where Windhawk's impact becomes impossible to ignore within the first 10 minutes of using it, because the Windows 11 taskbar represents one of the most thoroughly documented cases of Microsoft deliberately removing functionality that existed in Windows 10 without ever replacing it with anything equivalent. When Windows 11 launched in October 2021, the company stripped taskbar positioning out entirely. You could no longer drag it to the top, left, or right edge of your screen. The ability to resize it beyond Microsoft's fixed height disappeared. Combined and uncombined taskbar buttons with visible labels, a feature that had existed across every major Windows release for over 2 decades, simply vanished. If you were a dual monitor user who'd spent years running a vertical taskbar on a secondary display to maximize horizontal screen space, Windows 11 quietly told you that workflow was no longer supported. Microsoft's official framing was that the new centered taskbar was a deliberate aesthetic choice, and that removed functionality might return in future updates. Roughly 4 years later, most of it still hasn't. The taskbar clock customization mod deserves specific attention because it went through a major overhaul in late 2025 and is now genuinely one of the most feature-rich single modifications in the entire catalog. The base problem it solves is straightforward. Windows 11, by default, shows only hours and minutes in the system tray clock, forcing you to hover over it every time you actually need the date, interrupting whatever you were doing to get information that should already be sitting there. The mod adds the full date directly to the taskbar clock in customizable formats, with options for day of week, full date display, and time formatting preferences Windows settings never officially offered. The late 2025 update pushed it considerably further. It introduced live system metrics display right in the clock area, meaning you can now show GPU usage, disk activity, network transfer rate, battery percentage with status indicators, and RAM usage directly in your taskbar clock space, with no separate system monitoring software running in your tray at all. It added media player information, so the currently playing track title and artist show up right in the taskbar while music is running. It added a tooltip mode, a network adapter filter for anyone running multiple interfaces, and pixel-precise spacing controls. This isn't a minor quality of life tweak. It turns a strip of previously wasted taskbar real estate into a functional system dashboard I now check dozens of times a day, instead of opening Task Manager every time something feels sluggish. File Explorer is where Windhawk stops feeling like cosmetic adjustment and starts feeling like a genuine correction of design decisions that arguably should never have shipped in the first place. Windows 11's File Explorer has been one of the most criticized components of the entire operating system since launch, and for legitimate reasons. The navigation pane takes up a fixed amount of space with no resizing option. The default layout uses spacious item spacing that wastes significant screen area compared to the compact view Windows 10 used by default. Microsoft eventually added a compact mode option buried in the view menu, but its implementation is inconsistent across different Explorer sections. The right-click context menu was redesigned to show a reduced set of options by default, with the full classic menu accessible only through a Show More Options submenu that adds an extra click to actions that used to take exactly one. I hit that extra click hundreds of times before I even stopped consciously counting. Across a month of ordinary file management, that's an enormous amount of accumulated friction that becomes invisible precisely because it turns into routine. The Windows 11 File Explorer Styler mod addresses this across multiple fronts at once. It restores the classic context menu as the default right-click behavior, removing the Show More Options detour entirely. It lets you customize the navigation pane's layout, including resizing, reordering, and removing items you never actually use. And it restores compact view as a genuinely persistent default, rather than a setting that quietly resets on you. The taskbar volume control mod is a much smaller addition, but it gets an immediate reaction from literally everyone I've shown it to. It turns the taskbar itself into a volume slider you can adjust by scrolling your mouse wheel over it, with an optional setting that requires holding Control first, so an accidental scroll doesn't silently change your system volume. Every single person I've demonstrated this for has asked the exact same question within about 5 seconds. Why isn't this just built into Windows already? The Start menu is the part of Windows 11 that generated the loudest, most sustained criticism from the moment the operating system launched. And it's the area where Windhawk's mod catalog offers the widest range of genuinely different directions depending on what you actually want your Start menu to become. Microsoft's decision to remove live tiles from Windows 10 without replacing them with anything of comparable informational value, left behind a Start menu, that's essentially a static grid of pinned icons sitting above a recommended section that most users try to disable almost immediately. That recommended section surfaces recently opened files and newly installed applications using logic that often feels closer to a commercial content placement system than a genuine productivity feature. And for years, the only official way to reduce its footprint was a settings toggle that shrank it without ever fully removing it. Reviewers across essentially every major tech publication described the Windows 11 Start menu at launch as a meaningful step backward in functional density, and roughly 4 years of incremental updates have mostly adjusted it at the margins, rather than addressing the core complaints. The Windows 11 Start Menu Styler mod is consistently the second most installed mod in the entire Windhawk catalog, which tells you almost everything you need to know about how widespread this particular dissatisfaction actually is across the Windows user base. What makes it especially well designed is that it doesn't force a single alternative aesthetic on you. It runs through a community theme system with a substantial, steadily growing library of presets covering genuinely different directions. There are glassy, translucent designs that integrate cleanly with dark desktop setups and give the Start menu a visual language that feels considerably more premium than Microsoft's flat default. There are compact layouts that strip out wasted padding and meaningfully increase the information density of the pinned apps grid. There's a side-by-side theme that displays pinned applications next to the full apps list simultaneously, eliminating the need to toggle between two separate views, which happens to be exactly the interaction pattern Windows 10 users, with years of built-up muscle memory, have been asking for since Windows 11 first shipped. And there are themes that don't just shrink the recommended section, but remove it from the interface entirely. I tried 6 different themes across my first week and eventually settled on a compact, translucent design that cut the default Start menu's visual noise by roughly half, while keeping the pinned apps grid I actually rely on. Opening the Start menu now feels like opening something that belongs to my setup, rather than something installed on my machine for someone else's organizational purposes. The per monitor Alt-Tab behavior mod is one a significant portion of users won't need, but the ones who do need it have been asking for it since Windows 11 first launched. If you work across multiple monitors and run different applications on each display simultaneously, Windows 11's default Alt-Tab behavior shows you every open window across every monitor in a single combined switcher. For plenty of multi-monitor workflows, that's exactly what you want. But for users who treat each monitor as its own dedicated workspace with its own set of applications, seeing the full cross-monitor window list adds navigation overhead that compounds across hundreds of switching actions a day. The Windhawk mod for per-monitor Alt-Tab scopes the switcher down to only the windows present on whichever monitor your cursor currently sits on, making window switching noticeably faster and more precise for multi-monitor power users. This is functionality that's existed in specific Linux desktop environments and in macOS for years, and its absence from Windows has been a genuine productivity gap for a category of users that's grown substantially as dual monitor setups became standard in home offices after 2020. The notification system mods are worth spending real time on, because notification friction on Windows 11 is one of those problems that's almost entirely invisible until it's fixed, at which point you suddenly can't believe how much low-grade mental overhead you'd been spending managing a system that basically doesn't work. Windows 11's Notification Center stacks notifications from the same application in ways that make bulk dismissal genuinely cumbersome. The panel's layout prioritizes visual spacing over information density in a way that makes scrolling through and clearing a backlog slower than it needs to be. Most power users eventually just give up on the Notification Center entirely and rely on application-specific indicators instead, which means the notification system stops functioning as an actual attention management tool and turns into a pile of unread alerts, with an unread count badge nobody ever actually processes. The Windhawk mods addressing this add proper grouping controls, batch dismissal that clears every notification from a specific application in one click, and layout changes that meaningfully increase information density in the panel itself. After running these mods for a few weeks, I cleared my entire notification backlog faster than at any point since first upgrading to Windows 11, and I stopped developing the habitual notification blindness the default system had quietly trained into me. The classic context menu restoration deserves its own separate mention beyond the File Explorer discussion, because it affects right-click behavior across the entire Windows shell, not just Explorer specifically. The two-tier context menu Windows 11 introduced, where your right-click shows a simplified set of options, and you have to click Show More Options to reach the full menu Windows 10 displayed by default, adds friction to one of the single most frequently performed actions in daily Windows use. It's genuinely hard to overstate how many times per hour a typical user right-clicks something, and adding a mandatory extra click to reach options that used to be one step away compounds into a surprisingly significant daily annoyance. The Windhawk mod restoring the classic menu as default behavior is among the highest rated modifications in the entire catalog, reflecting an almost universally positive response from people who install it. After just one day running it, going back to Windows 11's default behavior on another machine felt like using a computer with a deliberate obstruction built directly into it. Before telling you to go install this, I want to address the stability and safety question directly and honestly, because any tool operating at the level Windhawk operates at deserves a straight answer rather than a dismissive reassurance. Windhawk works through a runtime code injection approach, applying modifications to running Windows processes dynamically rather than replacing or permanently altering files on disk. That's genuinely the correct architectural choice for a tool like this, because it means every modification exists only while Windhawk is actively running. And the moment you disable a mod or close the application entirely, Windows reverts to its unmodified state with no cleanup, rollback procedure, or system restore required. Nothing gets written permanently into system directories. Nothing is patched into core Windows binaries in a way that could survive an update and create conflicts with whatever Microsoft pushes out next. The modification layer sits on top of Windows rather than inside it, which is the core reason Windhawk mods tend to survive. Windows updates far more reliably than registry-based tweaks or file replacement approaches, the kind that break the moment Microsoft touches the underlying components those older tweaks depended on. The open source nature of every mod in the catalog isn't a marketing talking point. It's a genuinely meaningful piece of the security architecture. When you install a mod from the Windhawk marketplace, its source code is publicly available and reviewable by anyone with the technical background to read it, including the sizable community of developers and security researchers actively engaged in the Windows customization space. The most popular mods have been reviewed by thousands of technically sophisticated users across GitHub, Reddit, and the major Windows enthusiast forums. Maltsev himself has an established reputation in this community that predates Windhawk by over a decade through 7+ Taskbar Tweaker, a track record that represents a verifiable history of responsible, technically rigorous development you can examine independently rather than simply take on faith. It's worth being honest about the other side of this too. Because the catalog is open to community-submitted mods, and not every mod is written by Maltsev himself, the trust picture varies mod by mod. The sensible approach is sticking to mods with high install counts and strong ratings, which reflect real-world community vetting, rather than installing obscure, low-download mods from unfamiliar authors without at least a quick look at what they claim to do. Across several weeks running roughly a dozen active mods simultaneously through daily professional use, I experienced 0 system crashes, 0 blue screens, and 0 application conflicts I could actually attribute to Windhawk. Individual mods can be disabled in seconds from the interface if anything behaves unexpectedly, and the whole application uninstalls cleanly through the standard Windows Programs and Features panel if you ever want to return to a completely stock experience. The practical starting point for anyone new to this is simple. Go to windhawk.net, the official site, and download the installer directly from there rather than from any third-party mirror or search result link claiming to host it. Once it's installed, open the Explore tab and sort by installation count rather than by date or rating. Start with the handful of mods carrying the highest install numbers across the catalog, since those represent the modifications tested across the widest possible range of hardware and Windows build versions by the largest number of users. The Taskbar styler, the Start menu styler, the Taskbar clock customization mod, the classic context menu restoration, and the Taskbar volume scroll mod collectively cover the 5 biggest friction points in daily Windows 11 use, and together they'll produce a genuinely noticeable improvement in how the operating system feels within the first hour of installing them. Add mods incrementally from that baseline rather than installing 20 at once, since the incremental approach gives you a clear sense of exactly what each mod is contributing and makes it straightforward to isolate the source if any particular modification ever produces behavior you didn't expect. One more practical note worth including here, since it's the kind of thing that only becomes obvious after you've actually lived with the tool for a while. Windhawk requires administrator privileges to run, and on managed or corporate machines where you don't control local admin rights, it simply won't work. So this is really aimed at personal machines rather than a work laptop issued by an employer's IT department. It's also worth keeping half an eye on the Windhawk changelog after each major Windows feature update, since Microsoft occasionally changes internal Explorer or shell APIs in ways that briefly break specific mods until the Windhawk team or the individual mod author pushes a compatibility fix, something that's historically happened within days rather than weeks, given how actively the project is maintained. I want to say something here that doesn't come up enough in the broader Windows customization conversation. The existence of a tool like Windhawk and the scale of its adoption, hundreds of thousands of installations on its most popular individual mods across a catalog that's grown continuously since launch, tells you something specific and worth sitting with about the current relationship between Microsoft and its users. When a free open source tool built by an independent developer accumulates that level of adoption specifically because it restores functionality the operating system's own manufacturer deliberately removed, that isn't a niche enthusiast phenomenon. It's a genuine signal about how many people use Windows 11 every day while feeling a persistent, unclosed gap between what the operating system does and what they actually need it to do. To be fair, Microsoft has shown some incremental willingness to respond to specific complaints over Windows 11's lifespan. Partial restoration of taskbar options, the addition of a compact view in Explorer, gradual expansion of settings coverage for things that used to require registry edits. Those are real responses that show the feedback loop isn't entirely broken. But the pace of that response, measured against the scope of what still hasn't been addressed, is exactly why the Windhawk community kept growing as quickly as it did. If you've been using Windows 11 in its default state, treating its constraints as fixed conditions rather than the deliberate design choices they actually are, choices a free tool can override in a matter of minutes, this video was made specifically with you in mind. The download link is windhawk.net, and my personal list of recommended starting mods is in the description below. If this was useful, subscribe, because this channel covers exactly this category of free, privacy-respecting tools and techniques on a regular basis, the practical stuff aimed at making Windows actually work the way you need it to, rather than the way a product roadmap decided it should. Drop a comment with whichever mod made the single biggest immediate difference for you once you've installed it, because the answer genuinely varies more than you'd expect depending on how you actually use your machine. And those patterns are useful for where this series goes next, whether that ends up being a deeper dive into building your own mods, a broader comparison against the other tools in this space, or simply a running list of whichever new mods gain real traction in the months ahead. The version of Windows you're running right now is not the only version available to you. It just requires knowing exactly where to look.